Are you ready? I am Angel Borrelli, and welcome to Angel Borrelli Pitching. The 11th season of The Fix starts right now. This is March 27th, 2024, and tomorrow is opening day for Major League Baseball, and I am excited. And for today's first episode of the MLB season, I found my inspiration from an excellent article where the writer interviewed doctors, coaches, pitchers, and MLB executives about the dangerous state of pitching injuries. While they presented many differing opinions on why injuries are on the increase, I thought it was time for me to talk about how I solve these problems on a day-to-day basis in my work as a pitching motion troubleshooter. You will be learning about specific errors in the pitching motion that render a pitcher more vulnerable to injury and hopefully new ways to look at your pitchers. In addition to all that, and in the name of the proof is in the pudding, I thought you should hear from the other side of the plate, my catcher, Jacob Courtney. Jacob has been with me for 5 years, and I am happy to welcome him as the new co-host for this upcoming season. Hi, Jacob. I'm so happy to have you here with me, and welcome once again to another position on my team.
Hi, Angel. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very glad to get on the podcast. I feel honored, especially because I've listened to it before. And as your listeners know now, I've worked with you one-on-one before, and I've seen you work with your pitchers. Angel's an amazing person. And like you said, the proof is in the pudding. And I'm the one to vouch for that. I see the progress of all her pitchers, and I see the progress of all her work. And I'm very proud to say that I've worked with Angel. And so I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Angel.
Oh, I'm so happy. And it makes so much sense to me. And this season's going to be so great because we're going to be able to talk a lot of different languages because you're here. So anyway, but Jacob, before we start, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my background is I went to College Park High School, played baseball there. I went to a D2 out of high school, and with some school complications, I ended up transferring back to my hometown junior college, which is Diablo Valley College. It's a very popular junior college in the Northern California area, and it's my sophomore year there. I'm a catcher, obviously, and I'm looking for a home next year for the next 2 years to play baseball, and I'm excited to keep playing baseball.
Well, whatever team you decide to play for, Jacob, they're going to be really lucky to have you. So anyway, and once again, I'm so glad you're here. It's going to be an exciting season. So anyway, before we jump into the article that we're going to be talking about, I have a suggestion for all my listeners. And actually, it's probably a way that I want you to possibly think about and maybe listen to the information I'm going to be sharing with you, because I'm actually suggesting that you sort of look through a new lens. So here are some of my suggestions. Pitchers, any pitchers that are listening, I want you to start taking responsibility for your body and how you use it. Coaches, I want you to maybe try to avoid thinking that if you touch a pitcher's skill, something's going to change in the way he pitches. The pitching skill is not so transient that if you adjust something, the skill vanishes. With those two things in mind, pitchers and coaches think about their responsibility and also that the pitching motion isn't this delicate thing. You'll be able to take in a lot of the information you're going to hear today in a much easier way. Lastly, I think it's time to stop blaming the ball or the pitch or the progress that human performance is making for the reasons why we have injuries. As the pitcher's human potential improves, all that needs to be done is to add something to the equation. We have all this data on one side, but on the other side, we have to start thinking about the way the pitcher is doing what he's doing, not just he's throwing this many, he throws this often, this is his stuff. We have to start saying on the other side, well, maybe it's the way that he's throwing now that he's throwing harder. And so by opening your mind in those three ways, you can take in this information and possibly look at all of this from a new perspective. Okay, so let me introduce this article first of all. So, first of all, the article was in the Athletic Daily on March 19th. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. It was written by Ken Rosenthal, who was a great author and writer. And the article was entitled Prominent MLB Team Physician Sounds Alarm on Pitching Injuries. And that's exactly what this article does. So, first of all, I think you should all read it. And if you don't subscribe to The Athletic, you should, because it's a great, great way to get all the information across your desk every morning about what's going on in the MLB. But the first thing about this article, and I'm going to go through it because with each thing they say, I want to present another side of it, that other side of the equation. So, first, I want you to take what's being said in this article seriously, even though I'm going to kind of, in some ways, be not refuting, but maybe saying, I'm not sure about that. What they're saying is in their minds. This is in the minds of the experts. And we have to take the article seriously. And we should be happy about learning what are they actually thinking. And even though I feel that baseball has tons of blind spots, those of us out here who work independently, if we really believe that, well, then we have to continue to do the work that we do. And we have to continue to teach what we teach. And hopefully, reaching the right person at the right time will start to remove some of that. But mostly, we have to take in what's being thought and what's being said because we have to protect our pitchers. And remember, everything that happens in the MLB ends up trickling down to youth pitching, even. Or maybe it trickles up. Maybe that's where all these things start. Who knows? All I know is that there's a situation going on. And when you have physicians and you have executives starting to sound an alarm, then it's time to take it seriously. And I think in the last 11 years that I've had this podcast, and then I had a different one 3 years prior, I think every year at this time, I'm talking about injuries because, as you've seen, at the beginning of spring is when most of the injuries happen. We've got tons of guys on the IL already. So, anyway, let's get into this article. So, Jacob, I know you read the article, and I want to start with the first thing that was said, and I want you to explain what it means. So, in the very first paragraph of this article, the orthopedic surgeon is saying that the number of pitching injuries is on the increase, and he thinks it's because of the advent of the sweeper and the power changeup. And he thinks they're the reason for a spike in injuries. So I have something to say about blaming, quote unquote, a pitch. But would you explain to everybody, because I didn't know what this meant, I had to ask you, would you explain to everybody what's a power changeup?
So a power changeup, it's not found very often in youth baseball, high school baseball. It's starting to get there in college baseball, but in the majors, there's been a big increase in it in the past few years, which hasn't resulted, I don't want to say, but there has been an increase of arm injuries as well. But the power changeup is almost like a slider going the opposite way. So a righty's changeup usually moves down and a little arm side, but the power changeup is almost moving like a slider towards your arm side. I'm very unsure about how pitchers are even doing this, but they're finding a way. It's getting weird spin, and its velocity is increasing almost to high eights to nines at times.
Okay, so it's not just a changeup that's being thrown harder because everybody knows changeup isn't it usually about 10 miles an hour slower than the fastball? That's what makes it so
Yes,
devastating.
yes,
Okay, so they're not just saying that the 100 mile an hour pitcher is now throwing a 98 mile an hour changeup. They're not. It's not called a power changeup for that reason. It's maybe still going slower, but it's got different spin.
yes.
Okay. And he also mentioned the sweeper, and we talked about this last season because it came about at the beginning of the season. Isn't the sweeper just a cutter that doesn't move the correct way? Would you explain? I think that is the pitch, the cutter that it's sort of like if a cutter's not working, it looks like a sweeper. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, so the sweeper is kind of a mixture. of a slider and curve. So in the past, it's been called a slurve, but the slurve is very slow. And now people are learning how to throw that pitch as hard as they can, which again is getting into the eights and high eights, almost nines. And it's got a crazy amount of movement. But most of the time, it's pitchers who can't find a great slider or a great curveball, and they find this in between pitch that gets a lot of movement, but they don't really know how to keep replicating it every time. And it's kind of an in between pitch where they can't decide which pitch they want it to be.
Okay. And then later on in this article, so I'll just bring it up now, they mentioned that there's more curveballs being thrown, and they think that might also be the reason, even though Dr. Glenn Fleisig, who was also interviewed in this article, and I think all of you know, he is the biomechanist at the American Sports Medicine Institute. And they're the geniuses that do all the biomechanical work. And he happened to also be my mentor when I was in graduate school. It's why I have so much information. I mean, I followed his work because to do what I do, you have to understand biomechanics. But when he was interviewed and they were mentioning all these things, oh, it's the curveball, oh, it's the sweeper, oh, it's this, he said, well, and this is true, we've done research on the fastball and the curveball, and the curveball does not have any more forces on the elbow than the fastball. And they haven't looked at the sweeper yet, but he said, I don't think it's the sweeper. And he thinks it's because pitchers are throwing with max effort. So I want to talk about this issue for a minute. So let's say you are listening to this and you listen to what Jacob said and you go, yeah, my guy, that guy my pitcher is throwing a sweeper and, he just can't duplicate it. Well, this is why in my session, so I stay in my lane. That's why Jacob is so important to me, because I'm looking at the pitcher and I'm doing everything from a muscular point of view. So when I'm talking pitches, pitch types, and grips, I am talking about the muscles, the wrist, the forearm, the positioning of the fingers to make sure the fingers can move correctly. I'm not talking about maybe a grip or a pitch the way a pitching coach might. So when I have a pitcher come in, and because Jacob, we're probably going to be referring to pitchers that we know, but to keep their work private, we won't mention them by name. But we've had pitchers come in and they're throwing. You'll say, Angel, it's cutting, it's moving like a cutter, or Angel, his curveballs looking slurvy. So I always ask the pitcher, what is it that you're trying to throw? Because if the pitcher is trying to throw a curveball, and it's slurvy. So when I interview them, when they first arrive, I always ask, what types of pitches do you throw? I ask, what's your out pitch? And I ask, well, tell me about your other pitches. Show me your grips. And so that's when a pitcher might say, well, I have a curveball, but it's kind of slurvy. So my lights go up and I go, yay, we got something we're going to work on. So if a curveball is slurvy, that means he's not using the wrist correctly, because the curveball is actually a pitch that is thrown with everybody knows it's more of a chopping action on the baby finger side of the wrist. The palm is facing a right-handed pitcher. The palm is facing to his left, and you're throwing it off the middle finger. And when that wrist does that little chopping action, when I say chopping, I mean it's if you were chopping, it's the way it would work. It's called ulnar flexion. If the baby finger flexes towards the forearm, that brings those fingers over the top. It gives side spin, etc. And the other requirement of the curveball is the elbow is not as straight as in a fastball release. So if it's not breaking up and down, and it's slurving, meaning that it's going sideways, well, there's something wrong with the way the ball is being held in the hand or the wrist or the fingers. Now, do I know exactly what it is? No, because by the time he does it, the ball is gone. And I'm on a field. I'm not working with equipment with multiple cameras, etc., and sensors, but I am working with camera and film analysis. But the main thing I'm working with is the pitcher. And I rely on the pitcher to understand everything, because what he's thinking or what he's doing. So I want to cover the bases. So if a curveball isn't breaking, I do one thing at a time And usually the thing I do is I go up to him and I show him the action at the wrist with just a straight hand. And I say, this is what you're doing. And if it's not breaking downward, you're not doing that. And sure enough, that usually works. Now, am I right, Jacob?
Yes, we've seen that multiple times in our sessions.
Yes, exactly. And all it takes is for the pitcher to be reminded. Now, here's my rule. So, Jacob, and you know this for a fact, if I've got somebody, and I always start with looking at just wrist action, et cetera, and I actually isolate body part by body part. If Jacob looks at me and says his ball has a lot of run or it has a lot of cut or whatever word he uses because of the quality that he sees, I look at the pitcher and I say, do you want that? For example, if you don't want your fastball to cut or you don't want it to move in a certain way, and it does, you have to work on not having it do that. You can't just say, oh, my curveball looks like a slurve, or my fastball, yeah, it seems to cut, because there may be times you don't want that. So I ask them what they want. And the minute they say, yeah, I don't really have control over it, or yeah, that's what it does. And I'll say, well, is that what you want it to do? Because the pitcher has to have an arsenal of weapons. It's great if maybe he has a fastball that moves a certain way at times. But what if he wants to go right down the middle? Or what if he wants to do a certain thing? Then he is not able to do that. And the main thing with a pitcher is, and we are always dealing with the pitcher. I do not deal with pitching. I deal with the pitcher. I say, then let's get in the driver's seat with your fastball and figure out what you're doing. So here's the concept. And Jacob, before I go further, am I right about that we are able to sometimes eliminate unwanted movement?
Yeah, we've seen that a lot with a lot of our pitchers because they come in and they'll be throwing straight and we'll be playing catch and they'll throw one that has a lot of tail. And they're like, oh, I like that. But they can't find a way to do that again, except for maybe one in every five pitches where they put a little too much pressure on one of their fingers. But I think the biggest thing with you is you're getting them to be consistent with that. If you
Yes.
want the two seam movement, then do it every time and or throw a four seam and a two seam. Don't throw an accidental two seam.
Exactly. And if a pitcher doesn't have that confidence, and pitchers have to know they can repeat performances. In fact, I was reading an article yesterday that was defining what is an ace. And I don't want to tell you the lack of quote unquote aces the MLB thinks they have. And an ace is someone who leads the team. He does it all year. He gets into October. But guess what else? They can count on him to repeat his performances. Repeatability is because the pitcher has an arsenal. He knows exactly what each weapon is going to do. And therefore, when he sees the situation where he has to throw low and away, or he has to move into the hitter, or whatever it is that he is doing for a reason, he's got to know that that weapon works. Now, what I'm wanting to say here is, when the ball is not doing what you want it to do and you don't know what it's doing, but you're trying to make it work, that trying, not just the trying, but that extra effort and that searching creates injuries. Because if a ball is not moving correctly, it has to be done by the fingers and the wrist at the last moment. The wrist is the last joint that applies, let's say, velocity to the ball. Well, there is some, the fingers could be doing something, but let's think of it as this: the joint, the wrist, and the fingers are the last thing that are applying movement, etc., to the ball. Everything you do before that is up to what the wrist does. Now, the wrist has to be behind the ball to start, and then through the intricate movements, whether it's a slider and you're going sort of slightly on a diagonal axis to the baby finger side and then bringing it over, whatever you're doing, it's not direct like a four seam release. That forearm change, that wrist change is coming from the forearm. And the forearm is controlled by a joint below the elbow. So let's say you're coming through and your elbow's coming through. Let's say it's coming through first. Let's say you've got a problem with leading with the elbow. as you come through the pitch, and your arm is supposed to be looking like a four seam release until the very end when it's got enough length to it where it can rotate to create whatever pitch you're creating, whether it's the thumbs under, the slider, curveball, whatever it is. If the elbow leads, it automatically turns the hand into a curveball release position. The pitcher, without even knowing it, because he's skilled, has to turn it back to get it to be maybe the four seam release, maybe a changeup release, maybe a slider relief, whatever he's throwing. That muscular movement of the forearm, that movement, that rotation, when you're doing it because you have to, because you weren't behind the ball when you came through, when you were in the middle of your acceleration path, that creates tension in the forearm. That movement is not coming from forces that are transferred into the forearm from that level. The supination and pronation properties of the forearm, that's whether your hands palm up, palm down, and everything in between, that's controlled by that other joint. That's a muscular movement. And even though the pitcher's doing it automatically, when you're messing around with that and trying to get behind the ball, you're going to have pitches that either they're taking its toll. So let's say everybody's right. The sweeper, even someone who can repeat it, or the curveball, someone who doesn't know what's happening. Let's say the pitch is doing well or it's not doing well. If the pitcher is not accelerating his arm correctly and he's a guy that's doing it wrong, well, he's going to keep trying, not knowing what he's doing. And now he's got all kinds of things happening at the forearm level. And the forearm is usually the precursor to elbow injuries. And the injuries we're talking about that are the increase are usually the elbow. And then the second in line would be the shoulder. So when you have a ball that's not doing what the pitcher wants, or you have a ball that's doing something cool, but the pitcher doesn't know how it's happening, you have a pitcher who is manipulating at the last minute, and that's not a good thing because the thing that's being manipulated is the part of the body that gets mostly injured. So this leads me to reverse engineer this. So here we've got an article that's saying, okay, we've got pitches and they're throwing this more and we're getting more injuries. And so we're trying to figure out what to do. And some of them, I'm sure, are thinking, well, maybe we'll throw them less. In fact, they quoted a team in the article that their guys don't throw any sweepers at all. That's because their pitching coach is probably really smart and said this sweeper isn't a real pitch. It's a pitch that you're given a name to that happens to be a common flaw when you're trying to throw another type of pitch. So who knows? But the deal is, if we look at the pitches and say these pitches are bad, then we stop our thinking and we tune out. And the truth is, pitches themselves, the balls don't move correctly because something happened from the elbow down, which controls the wrist and the fingers, that made that pitcher pull off the ball incorrectly. This is why I isolate the wrist with all my pitchers so that I can see wrist throwing, so I can see what they're doing. Jacob, when we do wrist throws, and I have various things that we do with that, do you, once you see corrections, you can actually see spin when they're doing that, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And on some of them, I have you get down and you're able to see a curveball that breaks. You're able to see all the correct components when they're using just their elbow to extend and then into the wrist. Is that correct?
Exactly. It only takes about maybe 10 feet of space to realize if the spin is good or not.
Yes, exactly. And when something's incorrect, like we had a pitcher the other day who was having a trouble with, I think he was getting too much cut. And he was throwing a slider, I think. And I said, what finger do you throw the slider off of? You know, I have had slider guys and they tell me, well, I throw it off the index finger. Some pitching coaches say, no, you throw it off the middle finger. Well, the middle finger is the longest finger. So it gets in the action a lot. And I always ask the pitcher, what do you think you're throwing off of? And he'll say one thing, but his ball's moving like he's throwing off the other. And then, of course, you can tell by the way a ball's moving when he does the wrist stuff, which finger he's using more. So the other day I said, you know what? And I said to myself, this kid doesn't have any feel for his fingers. So I asked him, I said, I want you to lift your index finger off the ball and throw with just that. And then I want you to throw it with just the index finger on and lift the middle finger off. And of course, he's just throwing from the wrist. The elbow is bent at 90 degrees. He's got the wrist in hyperextension. He extends his elbow and delivers the ball. And as Jacob said, he's 15 feet away. And he learned not only the way the ball moves from each finger, and he learned to identify which finger he was giving dominance to. And while he continued on and had great success, every time the old error would occur, he would look at me and say, oh, I used too much of my index finger, or I used too much of my middle. And that's what I want. I want a pitcher in the driver's seat. So am I leaving anything out here about the pitches?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. One thing I would talk about while we're on this topic is kind of the death grip that is mentioned in the
Oh,
article as well.
yes, no, perfect time to bring it up. So I'm not sure what this so the doctor who was interviewed, and he's the one that actually sent out the SOS, and I thank him for doing that. And this is Dr. Meister from the Texas Rangers, who has a tremendous and awesome reputation. He mentioned something about that he thinks the pitchers are holding on to the ball too hard. And he talks about how, he knows pitchers from way back that said, oh, you should grip it real lightly, like you're, going to throw an egg. And he said that he thinks that the new grips, this new power change up, is putting stress on the elbow because he's calling it a death grip, that they're just holding on too tight. Am I quoting that correctly to your memory? I've got my notes in front of me and I'm searching for it here. Is that correct, Jacob? He said it's just that they're gripping onto the ball too tight.
Yeah, they're holding on to it as hard as they can to try to throw it as hard as they can. But
Yes, yes.
yeah,
And so that's what he thinks is happening. So let me tell you what I think is happening. And actually, Glenn said, so he's saying they're trying to throw things as hard as they can. And Glenn mentioned in the article, and I spoke with him after the article, and he said the same thing, that he thinks that, pitchers are trying to throw hard, that velocity is the thing. And in fact, part of this article talks about people sort of conjecturing that, well, maybe we need to start limiting pitch types, or maybe we need to put an emphasis more on location than velocity. You cannot stop human performance. That's not going to go away. Plus, velocity is too applauded. Once it's there, it's not going to go away. I mean, maybe it will, but I can't base my work on hopes and dreams. I have to deal with what's in front of me. My pitchers are coming to me trying to throw hard. Now, here's why I think trying to throw hard gets bad press. So, first of all, the body produces the pitch. I don't care what anybody says. The body is the machine that's producing and throwing the pitch. The brain of the pitcher is what is capable of having increased intensity. And that is why, through training methods, not on the field, pitchers are learning to be more intense. Now, if you're moving correctly and you're more intense, that's awesome. But let's say you've got a flaw. And let's say you're in high school and you're throwing 75. But let's say we're doing, oh, let's try to get him to throw harder. Well, let's say him throwing harder brings that flaw more to the surface, and then they injure themselves even more. And the deal is, there doesn't seem to be any emphasis. And this is what I was saying about we've got to balance the equation. We've got to accept power pitches. We've got to accept new pitches being designed. Pitches came about because somebody figured out if you put your finger here. I mean, look at the Vulcan grip, or look at the knuckle grips. Somebody one day said, oh, if I lift my finger off, it does this. Oh, if I stick the nail in, it does this. That's how pitches evolved. Who knows with this new thing that's coming around, that maybe that's going to be a whole new thing. Who knows? We don't know. But all I know is if a pitcher is throwing and his body isn't moving correctly. Just like if your chiropractor sees you and he sees you bending over incorrectly, or your athletic trainer sees you and they see you doing something incorrectly. There are rules of the bones and the muscles. And if you violate them, even as a normal human, you're going to end up injured. And everybody who's ever had a back pain or anything else, and they can go to, I lifted the box wrong, or I didn't bend my knees, or I had this thing, you know that the body always wins. And now, when you're doing a sport and you're performing, the body is got to be working absolutely perfectly. And the athletes that run the fastest, jump the highest, they are athletes. Think of somebody in gymnastics. Do you think that they can land incorrectly? They go through all these turns in the air, and if they don't land and stick their landing, they get points off and don't win because the body is supposed to decelerate and position itself correctly. Yet in baseball, it's totally okay if a pitcher throws himself down the hill, his knee buckles and he falls over to the left, his foot spins around when he does it. Nobody cares about how he finishes it. And to me, if a pitcher doesn't finish correctly, it tells you what he's doing before he finished. And that's the most violent part. So the baseball itself has not given balance to the equation. Okay, so maybe up till now it's been okay to think about all the other things. And even a biomechanical analysis can only go so far. Without it, I couldn't do my work. But with it in the hands of a pitcher, he's still got to say, okay, my arm's at the wrong angle. He's still got to turn to someone like me and say, okay, well, why isn't my arm in the right angle? I can't just change that. Where does that not getting in the right angle start? So, for example, with the discussion of the death grip, trying to throw hard, if a pitcher is not getting close to the plate with his hand, let's say he's using his front leg the way a hitter does. Let's say a pitcher's not getting close to the plate, and he's because when he strides, he's crossing over. His a right-handed pitcher, his left foot is landing way to his right, and he can't get his hips through. Those two things that happen during with the stride with the lower body are two reasons why the pitcher's pitch is not coming out of the hand with the velocity with which he maybe is throwing. In other words, if as you release the ball in the first example, you pull your leg backward and you straighten the knee backward the way a hitter does that, right, Jacob?
Yeah,
So that you don't go with the bat and the ball, right? You're
exactly.
stabilizing backwards to keep you from going forward. Guys, the pitcher goes forward. The upper body goes forward. His back leg is stabilizing him, but his hips are over his leg. But because everybody hit before they pitched, pitchers use a front leg that's like a hitter. So guess what? The hand is not as close to the plate as possible. So that pitch, if it was coming out closer, would be seen as way faster and it would actually realize a different type of velocity. And coaches, you don't question when a pitcher does that. When a pitcher says, I want more velocity, that's the first thing you should look for. Because guess what? By working with the leg, you can increase his velocity and never touch the arm unless you have to. In fact, don't touch the arm unless you fix that first, because fixing that fixes the arm oftentimes if there is an arm problem. Let's take the second scenario. And guys, you know this. This is allowed. A pitcher strides out and he lands a right-handed pitcher with his left leg way over to his right. So if you're standing behind the rubber, his legs look like a scissors. He's completely crossed over. When he starts to rotate his pelvis, which is where velocity development begins, he cannot get his hips square. The hips stop, so they're facing on an angle. His upper body continues to rotate without the energy of the lower body. And then the rotation is off, and then the velocity's not there. He may be throwing 100 miles an hour, but guess what? He's still not throwing with all the velocity. Now, in the case of the pitcher that is pulling his leg back, let's say he's got great mechanics, he lands correctly, but he does that. He can't get over his front leg, which means his deceleration is off, which means he's losing velocity. Okay, and he's pulling backwards when he's supposed to be going forward. Now, let's say the second scenario. You've got the pitcher who's crossing over his front leg. Well, his hips are blocked, as I said. Well, because his hips are blocked, his arm gets jammed up too. So his body ends up squaring up because his pelvis stopped. So his trunk had to rush in. And now you've got a guy crossed up on the bottom. His hips are facing to the right of the plate. His chest has now turned square, but he cut off time from that rotational phase. Now his ball is not ready to go, but he is. Well, he's got to get that ball in position. So he has two choices. One, lead with the elbow to give himself an extra beat, and then the ball is ready to go. The second is just release the elbow out to the side, and so his arm looks like he's sidearm. In the first case, he's leading with the elbow. That rotates the forearm. Now he's got to rotate the hand to be back behind the ball. And guess what? All the energy of the fast moving shoulder joint ends up lost. But the pitch gets off, and it might still even be good. But is he going to get hurt? Yes, in a number of possible places. Not so much the elbow, even though leading with the elbow is called leading with the elbow, it's really a shoulder action that is incorrect. Instead of the shoulder internally rotate, which it does real easily when the arm's right, it's called horizontal adduction. And that is the terms for people who know what it means. But what it means to the listeners is he's supposed to do A and he's doing B instead. And if he's making the pitching like that, he's really doing a good job of finagling his forearm and his wrist at the last second to be behind the ball. So when we talk about the pitches aren't right, you need to look to the body to see what he's doing because that ball didn't change. The seams don't change. The fingers don't change. The wrist is the same, especially when you've got the guy who's just standing there doing wrist flips and he's doing the release and he's perfect. Then he gets on the mound and he's a mess. That's because his body didn't put the hand where it was supposed to be in the correct position that it's in. So, Jacob, first of all, have you seen these errors with pitchers you catch?
Yes, I see it all the time, especially at a junior college level where most people are coming from high schools where they didn't get taught, but they have the potential to be great. And they're making these little mistakes that are costing them velocity, costing them accuracy, and in the long run, costing them possible injuries. And that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, and would you agree that it's real easy to see someone who crosses over, right?
Oh, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, and it's real easy to see a pitcher who pulls himself backwards at the release point. And you see how easy it is to see. Do you ever see coaches? Because I think these are two things that are accepted in baseball. And they're the two things that lead to this problem. Baseball hates these pitch problem and they hate the injuries, but they're not looking at two things that happen most frequently as the source of how they could make a difference in those areas. Do you agree with that?
I definitely agree, and I feel like some coaches use those as corrections almost. I know one pitcher that had a problem with flying open, and somebody told him his front shoulder was flying open and his arm was behind. So he decided, or a coach decided for him, that he was going to step across his body to keep himself closed, which is just going to hurt his arm and hurt his velocity as well. He has no hips in his throwing because he's stepping across. So it's almost, some people use it as a correction, even though the problem is not with the hips. It's not with where your feet are landing. Where your feet are landing, if you close, is going to cause more problems.
Exactly. And I was watching some pitchers this morning that they were calling some of the best pitchers, and I was watching them pitch, and not one of them crossed over. They opened up. Zach Wheeler's one, Spencer Strider, another one. Oh, and Spencer Strider, if you want to look at a guy who's confident in his lower body, just let somebody tell him to cross over. He was crazy. And I'll tell you why. Obviously he trains. And in the gym, a strength coach would never allow somebody who's training to do a lunge and to step across. So let's imagine a left leg lead in a walking lunge, which you see on the field all the time. And let's say the pitcher or the guy steps out with his left leg and he places it all the way across his right leg. A coach would never allow that. In fact, the pitcher would figure out he's going to fall over. So tell me, why would it even, and it's not allowed in the gym when you have weight on your shoulders for sure. Why would you think that it would be a good way to go down the hill? Now, here's the deal. We have had pitchers that do that. And of course, the coaches see the ball is coming out of the hand very deceptively because they're all twisted up. So they think it's good, or they don't see anything that pitcher's doing as bad because they're not really looking at that. They're just saying, man, this guy's got a lot of deception, or wow, the ball comes out of nowhere. And usually the pitcher can't usually has a kind of a low release point. And this is all because his arm can't do what it wants to do. It's doing what it needs to do because of where the body put the arm. You have to remember, the arm's going along in a sense. It's attached to the trunk's attached to the legs, and everything's moving out. And the arm is the last thing that places itself. The arm goes where the body puts it. The arm goes out from the rotation of the upper trunk along with the energy going through the shoulder joint. And if that trunk or something is doing something strange, the guy is still going to throw the ball. To hear that people are using that as a correction, I mean, coaches think it works. And nobody does something that, I mean, if somebody knew this, they would never suggest it. But that's how scary and the kind of blind spot. And I think that's bringing up the point that I want everyone to get from this wonderful article that was written. Yes, take this as true. There's problems, and they're searching around for answers, and they're looking at the pitches, and they're looking at effort. But if you're not doing something right, the hand ends up having to fight with the release. And if you're really good, you're going to get it done anyway. That's why good pitchers get hurt. And if you're not good and you're trying it, you'll never throw really hard enough. You might not get injured. But these errors of the body are what have to be looked at before you can say, and this is, I think, the point, before you can say there's a problem with the curveball, there's a problem with sliders. We have to not let our pitchers throw three sliders in a row. We have to be careful about this. Before you go to the arsenal, before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, look to the motion, because the motion is where we make changes. And Jacob, proof in the pudding, do we have happy pitchers when they leave?
Yes. You can see it on their faces by the time they leave.
Yes. And do we see a correction of the thing that they came in for?
Yes.
And do we see a reduction in pain when they do it right, and it hurts when they do it wrong?
Yes. And we're very careful when they do it wrong as well. Take care of our pitchers.
Yes. So the main thing my job is to show them that they won't hurt if they do it right. Now, are they able to repeat that after one session when we do the discovery? No, absolutely not. And I do what's called a forensic analysis. They come in with, I'm not throwing hard enough. I can't locate my slider. I have funny spin. My shoulder hurts. My forearm hurts. My elbow hurts. And I take film and I look and I do what's called a forensic analysis. I look at where the thing body hurts, what's not right. And then I move from where does that issue start? I see the issue. Oh, he's doing this. And then I say, where does that start? So I have to work backwards. And then I find out the first thing that goes wrong. And a pitcher always goes wrong somewhere. And then the rest is just a result of that. So if you learn to look at the pitching motion as a chain of events, now, the injuries that occur to the forearm and the elbow are always, unless it's an acute injury, they're due to a mismanagement of the way the shoulder pulls the arm through. They're usually something that happens at that moment, but that problem is usually created at the beginning of the motion with the arm angle when the pitcher starts. It is often created by the way the pitcher comes out of the glove, and it forces a certain type of position of the arm. The motion only takes less than 2 seconds. So if you are making an error at the beginning of the motion, even though, like, let's say you've got the ball twisted, and I see this in young kids all the time, they'll come out of the glove with the ball facing the sky.
Yeah.
Okay, it's that obvious. I know. I don't work with that many youth pitchers anymore, but oh, that was like fixing the way. So the error happens like 2 seconds out of the glove, not 2 seconds, 2 milliseconds out of the glove. A pitcher kind of knows he's got to face the ball in a specific direction, but he doesn't have time to fix it in the middle of the motion. So movements are created by joint angles, and the body's picking up your messaging. So anytime you have a problem in a joint not working right, the body had picked up that message before you did it. And so everything's sort of planned out. So the beginning of the motion is critical. And you will find that most problems with a pitching motion, when I do my analysis, usually it has something to do with the beginning of the motion. Not to say that that didn't build in a bad pattern at the end, but it guarantees that you must fix what is happening at the beginning first. Anyway, so I hope that I'm shedding some great light onto this dark topic of injuries. Jacob, have I missed anything or not said anything about this article that I should have talked about?
I don't believe so. I feel like we've covered it in depth so far. That's all I have on this.
Okay, great. So listen, everyone. So I was thinking to myself, okay, so what are the solutions here? Well, first of all, we're gonna continue on this topic all season with my helping you see the pitching motion in a different way. I want you all to read this article, and I want you to start thinking about the things I mentioned, especially pitchers. I want you to start thinking about how you do what you do, not what you do, but how you do it. This is a rule as a strength coach that I use. As an Olympic weightlifting coach, I use it. Cleans and snatches have to be done perfectly. And really and truly, the way out is not to add things in, but sometimes to go to what you're doing and to clean it up a little bit. But I want everyone to start shifting the way they're thinking and saying, you know what? Let's stop thinking externally and let's think internally. Let's stop looking at the pitches and let's start looking at the pitcher, which is what my specialty is. In fact, in my graduate thesis, one of my chapters was called Putting the Pitcher Back into the Pitch, because I think it's funny that everybody talks about the ball, the spin, the this, the that, the other, and nobody talks about the pitcher's leg or the foot or his arm or the way he rotated his trunk. I think that's kind of a interesting thing. So there's people out there that do the first all the time. I'm suggesting let's let in the second approach by looking actually at the pitcher and his motion. So one of the things I want to tell all of you about is, so a few weeks ago, I got a call from a coach that is a listener, and he hired me to take one of his pitchers, do a long distance analysis. And what he did that was different than anything that I'd ever done before is he had all the coaches on the phone with me, not on the phone. We were on the phone, but they were all looking at their screen with an email of still shots that I had sent, because I do my long distance analysis through still shots of the pitcher. And I explained the story. And so he had everyone on the line. This is a lefty pitcher with tons of talent. Has been injured since last July. No doctor, nobody could figure out what was wrong. And he said, Angel, I need help. He's down in San Luis Obispo. His name's Steve Harrow, and he's at Mission College Prep. And he said, let's do an analysis on him. And there was the head coach, the assistant coach, and the pitcher. It was great. And so they got all the pictures. And I called him this morning and I said, Steve, I want to know something, because I want to mention, is this something I should offer to other coaches who are inspired by what I'm saying? And I said, I want to know, by using this one pitcher as an example, did you learn what you saw, I know you saw everything, and they were amazed at what was laid out. And because it's still shots, they not only see the flaw, but they see where it starts. It's perfect. I said, I know you were able to apply this with the pitcher himself, but were you able to extrapolate any information and take it to the rest of the did the other coaches go on the field that day being smarter or looking at their motion differently? He said 110%. That was his answer. He said he's doing it with the hitting. He said they constantly are talking now about it. And he said one of the main things they got is from looking at the photos and listening to me describe everything, they created a new language. And he said the vocabulary we have now for looking at a picture and seeing what he's doing is an amazing thing. And he said, absolutely. And then he sent me a follow-up email and said, we not only loved it, we're going to start using it. So if you're interested, email me at angel@gymscience.com. Also, if you're interested, make sure you check out my website at Angel Borrelli Pitching. And Jacob, I cannot thank you enough for your input today. And it was so great having you here. I love working with you on the field, but this is even better. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me on. Again, it's such an honor being able to be on a show with you like this and be able to be a part of you sharing your knowledge with the world and all the young baseball players and coaches out there. So thank you.
Yes, well, you're very welcome, and I can't wait for our next episode. So everybody, call me, email me, contact me any way you want, and let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts. And I am so happy to be able to teach you, and thank you for making my 11th season successful. I can't believe I'm here, but I am. So thank you, and I can't wait for opening day tomorrow. Bye-bye.